Most of us use radio waves every day, even if we may sometimes not realize it. They're in our cars, phones, and even in our military systems. Radar is an important defense mechanism used to detect faraway objects. However, the type of radio technology you are probably most familiar with is radio modulation, which is used in all the types of radios you use. Radio modulation is the process where any combination of amplitude, frequency, and phase, and other variables of a wave are varied in accordance with information that is to be transmitted. There are two types of radio modulation: analog and digital modulation. Analog modulation is the process of transferring a low-frequency signal or an analog baseband, like an audio or TV signal, over a higher frequency signal such as a radio frequency band. But that's a really long and boring definition. What does that really mean? First of all, AM radio is only a single type of analog modulation. Back to the definition, a low-frequency signal could be something like audio or some of the really older TV broadcasts. It's the content that you're trying to send. This low-frequency signal then gets translated into a radio wave that will change its properties to convey the information. That information may, for instance, correspond to the sounds to be reproduced by a car radio or the darkness of a pixel on a black and white TV. Some popular types of analog modulation are amplitude modulation, frequency modulation, and phase modulation. Amplitude modulation is modifying the wave's amplitude to carry information. The changes in amplitude of the new wave are then calculated on the receiving end and decoded into the original information. Frequency modulation is similar to amplitude modulation, except that instead of changing the amplitude of the new wave, its frequency is changed. Unlike AM, FM can transmit stereo sound information, making it ideal to transmit music. This is why all the boring AM stations are either talk shows or news updates, and all the FM radio stations are music stations. Phase modulation works by transmitting two waves and detecting the difference in phases between the two waves. There's some complex math that they use to translate this, but we don't really have time to get into that.
Digital modulation is the second type of radio modulation. Digital is similar to analog modulation, but instead of the data being directly translated to radio waves, it is converted to binary ones and zeros and then translated to a radio wave. Different types of digital modulation are amplitude shift keying, frequency shift keying, and phase shift keying. Amplitude shift keying, or ASK, is a type of digital modulation that represents digital data as changes in the amplitude of a carrier wave. A 1 is represented by a fixed amplitude on a fixed frequency for a fixed period. If the wave isn't formatted as such, then the period is translated as a 0. This series of 1s and 0s is then decoded back to the original information. Frequency shift keying is a form of frequency modulation where digital information is transmitted through discrete frequency changes of a carrier signal. This technology is used for communication systems including radio, emergency broadcasts, and caller ID. Phase shift keying is a digital modulation scheme where information is conveyed by changing the phase of the carrier wave. The modulation is varied by changing the sine and cosine values of the wave at specific times. PSK is used in LANs, radio frequency ID tags, and Bluetooth. Analog modulation mainly uses AM and FM technologies to transmit information. Modern mobile communication systems mainly use digital modulation techniques because there are various advantages of digital modulation. Digital has a greater immunity to noise and can pass through tunnels and structures without losing data. This is because digital modulation sends multiple copies of the same data in a wave, so even if part of a wave is lost, the information can be recovered from another copy that was sent. Digital modulation also uses multiplexing, which is the combining of sources of information over the same wave, like TV broadcasts and radio waves. In addition, digital modulation has a greater security encryption and also has more flexibility in terms of types.
The first historical use of radio technology was by Heinrich Hertz. Although he didn't use radio modulation to send information, he first proved in 1888 that electromagnetic signals could be sent wirelessly. He thought this discovery would be rather useless, but it ended up being the foundation of what much of our communications network is built upon today. Ernst Alexanderson was responsible for the first example of radio modulation in 1906 for creating the Alexanderson alternator. This was a rotating machine which allowed for sound to be converted from mechanical energy to alternating current, and it was used as a radio transmitter. The Alexanderson alternator was one of the first devices invented that was capable of generating the continuous radio waves which were needed for the transmission of amplitude modulation by radio. In 1910, this machine was used in long-wave radio telegraphy stations to transmit transoceanic message traffic through Morse code worldwide. This technology then became obsolete in the 1920s due to the invention of vacuum tube transmitters, but the Alexanderson alternator remains on the list of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers milestones as a major achievement in electrical engineering. With radio being so abundant in modern-day communication systems, you may wonder how we manage to not mix up signals. Why doesn't your car or cell phone sometimes pick up other people's conversations or radio stations? In the early days of the radio, they did. In fact, it got so bad that it prompted the creation of the FCC to regulate and manage the use of certain frequency ranges to specific technologies. While the FCC performs many other functions, to this day, this remains its primary duty.